All right, welcome everyone. Whether you're experiencing your morning coffee or your afternoon lunch or your evening dinner, or in the case of Eamon, if it's 2 a.m. in Thailand and you're pushing the beyond midnight oil, I thank you for coming today on this Sunday and or Monday, wherever you may be. Oh, I'm gonna let somebody in here for this special Rising Tide Foundation geopolitical history philosophy lecture. I don't want to categorize it because I don't know where this is going to go. And I've been a good friend of Eamon McKinney for a couple of years now, and every time we talk, there's always a lot. We jump around, and it's fun. And Eamon has a really great way of thinking about not just the contemporary political situation that we're in, but he's bringing a lot of life experience, a lot of insight, a lot of philosophy, a lot of thoughts that he's worked deeply on over many decades. And we often would like to do other things, more constructive things with our time than having to debunk misinformation, gossipy stories about China or about Russia. But unfortunately, reality is what it is, and there is a weaponization of information, and a lot of very good people, unfortunately, are losing focus on the historical dynamics that have brought us to the present, that are shaping our future. And so, because of a sort of lack of understanding on how to think about ideas, intentions, different cultures, how to put yourself into the shoes of somebody from China or from the other part of the world is a very difficult thing. And thus, that difficulty has made it easy for people to drink FBI, CIA, MI6 runs, creative writing Kool-Aid. And so we have to do our extra work. And Eamon is somebody who has lived and worked in China since the 70s, as a high roller in the business world, as somebody who has developed a lot of political insights along the way, and has really been just a lover of truth. So I'm very happy, Eamon, that you were able to take this 2 a.m. experience and join us. So, like usual, what we'll do after Eamon's remarks, we'll have a little flowing discussion. If people want to ask a question, I ask that you either write your name in the chat box and I'll call upon you like usual, or if you want me to ask the question, make it a very short, concise question, and I will read it to Eamon. So that's it. Eamon, it's all yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matt. I'm sure I owe you a few early mornings, but it's actually only 1 a.m. here. I think the clock changed yesterday. Good introduction, by the way. Thank you. Well, good day, everybody, wherever you are. As Matt said, Matt and I think, go back about coming up 3 years. And we both used to write for the Strategic Culture Foundation. As Matt said, I have a long background with China. I first arrived there September the 9th, 1976. The day Mao died. I was there for 2 years as a foreign student. Then I was away. I was in America for a year. Then I was back in China for 5 years. During that time, I was working for a large oil company. I was VP there. And it was during that time that I did my PhD back at Tsinghua. I've had a business in China since 1985. I don't think I'd ever describe myself as a high roller, but thanks anyway, Matt. So I have experience with China, and I've seen most of the journey up until this date, from the day when Mao died, when essentially everything changed. My observation is that there's actually very, very few subjects that are as poorly reported in the West as China. So if I'm talking about China, normally I ask the crowd a question, which is, have you ever heard in the Western media one positive word about China, ever? That's somewhat of a rhetorical question. I think I know the answer. I could ask you the same question. If you live in the West, have you ever heard one positive word about Russia? Again, that's a rhetorical question. I believe I know the answer. So that's the narrative. And if you're listening to Matt, wherever you are in the world, I think the one thing that unites you is you don't believe the narrative. You don't believe what you're being told. So to talk about China, everybody talks about China from a very Western-centric point of view. We attribute to them qualities that and deficits, you might say, that we have ourselves. So much of what you see about China is projecting. But nobody ever talks about what is the Chinese mindset, what is it that drives them. Everybody in China is aware, they're all taught about it, about the Century of Shame. This dates loosely from 1850 to around 1950 when you had the Communist Revolution. But from that period forward, the thing that has driven the Chinese experience is that Century of Shame. Now, during that Century of Shame, China was occupied by 8 different colonies, where the Chinese people essentially had no legal retribution against any of these people. They were treated as third-class citizens. The country was plundered, was flooded with opium to keep people in line. 1950, the Communist Revolution succeeded. Kuomintang fled to Taiwan, took all the Chinese gold with them. Now, it's this Century of Shame that informs China's thinking today. What was that shame? Well, the shame was that the government couldn't protect their people against the Western financial vampires. Fathers couldn't protect their families. That was the Century of Humiliation, and they're not about to let it happen again. Now, in the early 1900s, when it was obvious that the fading, corrupt and weak Qin dynasty was failing, they sent their scholars all around the world to look at different political systems. What would replace it? What would replace the dynastic power hierarchy that they had for thousands of years? So some, like Deng Xiaoping, he went to Paris. He studied communism deeply. People like Sun Yat-sen, they went to America. Now, Sun Yat-sen reported that there was much he liked about America. They liked the Constitution, most of it. They liked the Lincolnian banking system, where they were talking about public funds for infrastructure development and everything. But what they took away from it was that even the Republic, with all the noble ideals cemented in its foundation, they couldn't protect their people from that same financial class. They saw the enormous class and financial divide between the oligarchs and the power brokers and the people who lived in squalor comparable to what he'd left in China. He was asked what he thought when he left, and he said he liked it, but the system wouldn't work in China. To which they inquired why. Well, he said, we've got a 100-year project and a 4-year mandate just isn't enough. So everything that China has done has been based on what they learned from seeing the failures in other systems. But it was centered around this premise that never again would they enter a century of shame where they couldn't protect their people from these financial vampires. Because although we're talking about 8 separate empires that were there in China, behind the empire is the financial power. In the British case, it was the City of London. The American case, it was the City of London. But this was the case with all of them. So China understands who the enemy is. Now, the way their economy is structured, the way their society is structured, is based on developing Chinese capabilities of making themselves sufficient. And this is why we've had so much animosity from the West towards China. It's not because they pose a military threat. In 5,000 years, they've never invaded anybody. They're not an expansionist power. It's not in their mindset. But they look at it like this. If you take any economy, you can say you have 2 sectors. You have the productive sector, which is manufacturing, agriculture, construction, where things are actually produced. And you have the parasite sector. The parasite sector lives on the productive sector. And the biggest parasite, obviously, is the government, because it produces absolutely nothing and takes what it wants. But then you have the service sector, the financial services. In America, the regulatory agencies, the healthcare sector, the legal system, these are all parasites that wouldn't exist and that's how we're feeding off the productive sector. Now, as an example, if you go back to 1970 in America, about 80% of GDP came from the productive sector, primarily manufacturing. Today, it's about 13%. But the parasite sector has grown to such an extent that American business is uncompetitive. Now, in China, protecting their people from that parasite sector of the economy is paramount. So therefore, the essentials called the Maslow's social hierarchy of needs, which is energy, education, security, transportation, healthcare, these are all provided by the state. And they're provided in a way where profit is not the major motivating factor. It's to enable the society and to enable, business to flourish. Now, one of the things that the Chinese learned when they saw the communist model and they saw it fail was that beyond all the ideals, this obsession with a class struggle and the distribution of wealth, it didn't work. And in most of the pure Marxist economies, it's always about the distribution of wealth, but they missed the essential point. In order to distribute wealth, you first have to create it. They also learned that collectivism doesn't work and that people do what they're incentivized to do. The Chinese have always had an inbuilt fierce commercial instinct, and it was always the point to use the state sector to enable the growth of the private sector. And that's where most of the growth in the Chinese economy has come from. But the Chinese are never going to open their capital markets and let the West in to start messing around with those. And they're never going to privatize their state sector. Now, it's because of the economic model that they've got, that they've enjoyed the economic success that they've achieved, because they know how to get things done. The most important factor of the Chinese economy is the public banking. It is not a Rothschild's private debt-based central bank. Therefore, they're able to do things that the private sector can't do. Now, I've given you this example before, Matt, but I'll repeat it. And I want to give you an example about how that works. So going back about 20 years now, when they really started working on these infrastructure projects in a big way. So you've got Shanghai down here on one side, and then you've got the Yangtze Delta, which is about 18 kilometers across. And on the other side, you've got Nantong province and the city of Nantong. So at the time, now, from Nantong to Shanghai, as the crow flies, about 40 or 50 kilometers. But to go from Nantong to Shanghai, you had to drive up the peninsula and down again. It was about 7 hours. So they built what was at the time the Sutong Bridge, the largest river crossing bridge in the world. How did they do it? Well, the government produced a government bond, which they issued jointly to the two cities, Suzhou and Nantong. 25 years, low interest loan. So the bridge gets built. The only financial return on investment here is the tolls, the miserable financial return. So the tolls are collected on either side, and Nantong and Suzhou, between them, pay off the bond, which has been done. Now, with private capital, that bridge doesn't get built. It doesn't get built because although the bridge will pay for itself in time, it takes too long and the returns are too low. So in the West, it doesn't get built. In China, they don't care if it takes 20 years to pay it off. It pays for itself, and they're patient. But you see, it's different because private capital can only look at the tolls as a return. The Chinese government doesn't look at it like that. So there's 400,000 cars a day that cross that bridge. 1.5 passengers in each car, 600,000 people times 700,000 times 7 hours. They're saving 3.5 million hours a day by building the bridge. 7 hours a day, 3.5 million hours a day that can be put to some worthwhile human endeavor. They're not burning petrol. They're not creating pollution. And the GDP on both sides of that bridge has gone through the roof. The bond has been retired. The bridge is there. It's still collecting tolls. And they've also built a tunnel now under the same way. That's how it works. Now, that's the model that they're employing along the Belt and Road. That's the model that they're bringing for all this development to Africa and everywhere else. It is the financial model that enables the development. Now, the interesting thing about the Chinese model, and they will always say, copy it, take what you want from it, but don't try and copy us exactly because it's uniquely Chinese in so many ways. But what it has shown the rest of the world, the developing world, the global south, as I like to call it, it's shown them a development economic model. If you want to build a strong economy, this is how you do it. And most of the countries now in the global south, once this inevitable reset happens, that's the model that they will be following. That's why there's all the resentment about China, because the cabal, it doesn't like bad examples, and China is a bad example. So that's kind of a brief overview on it. Expect to continue to hear nothing about negativity about China. But again, it's all, you know, when you hear it, it's generally a very, very predictable narrative. They've kind of given up on the Uyghur thing. That's completely fallen apart. The only thing they have that they think they have on China is obviously the Taiwan issue. And you keep hearing people talking about Chinese aggression towards Taiwan. What we have seen is 72 years of unbelievable restraint against 72 years of American provocations over Taiwan. In 1950, the US Marines launched an invasion from Taiwan with some of these Taiwanese Kuomintang back into China, but it failed. They got no support. There's very good research to make the case that both the Korean War and the Vietnam War were essentially about China. And many people are now saying the same thing about Russia, that the conflict in Russia, in Ukraine, this ultimately is about China. So the old system, the Western financial system, has never been for the good of humanity. The banks are there. They consider that the economy is there to serve the banks. The Chinese model of public banking, which they did not create, you know, in fact, they learned that from America, as Matt's pointed out very well in some of his work. But it is that model that is the threat to the system. Now, the existing system in the West, that can't be changed. It's so corrupt, it's so rotten, it's penetrated so many of the institutions. That cannot be changed. You cannot change an entrenched system. What you do is create an alternative, a better model. And that one in turn makes the old model obsolete by definition. And that's what we're witnessing at the moment. Let me stop talking there, Matt.
No, that we're talking about focus. I think that you just developed in a very short, effective manner of speaking a lot of focus for people to think about what's really important. What are the high valued ideas that are shaping our world? So before we open up for a Q&A, I just want to point out, I was looking at some of the statistics, and the Chinese, just touching upon what you were saying about their idea of economic value and how things are able to be built more efficiently, more quickly, and even a lot more cheaply than similar projects in the West, which either don't get built, or if they do, it's magnitudes above estimated cost. and usually it'll fall apart. Now, the thing with China, that 90% of their revenues go towards the real economy. There's actually an immediate turnover and reinvestment back into the real sector of measurable productive value, which is unlike anything we have from the basket case transatlantic, which is just one of many variables. And what you said about also the idea of time and how they're thinking about time saved in a volume manner. That's excellent, excellent concepts. So thank you for introducing those things. The first question that I have coming in is from Kevin Champagne, who had a thought question. Kevin, are you still there?
Yep. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Great, Kevin.
Hi. Well, thank you for being here, Dr. Mack. My question is in regards to the example of the bridge that you mentioned. Pretty simple question, actually. When the bond for the bridge comes to maturity, do the Chinese government plan on keeping the toll there, or will they remove it, or what's the plan? Do you know?
They would. No, the Chinese are not famous for giving things back. I haven't been over that bridge for some time, but they've built a tunnel as well. I'm sure they'll be collecting the tolls. They have a lot of toll highways in China now as well. But no, that would be out of character for the Chinese to give something back. No, I mean, I will tell you that people have this idea about Chinese socialism that like it's some sort of socialist paradise, everything's free. Don't ever say free to the Chinese. What the Chinese will say to you, look, there is nothing free. It's just a question of who pays for it. You know, it's like the Americans always bring up socialized healthcare, free healthcare. No, it's not free. It's just a question of who and how it's paid for. You know, if you ever, so in China, it's exactly the same thing. Everything is paid for. There's no free healthcare. Now, most of them have healthcare insurance through their business. But even if they have to go to the hospital, it costs nothing. I mean, it's dirt cheap. It's not a profit-making exercise. The only thing is schooling. Kids get free schooling. If you go to university, you pay. You go to the hospital, you pay. You get on a train, you pay. But none of these things take a huge chunk out of people's earnings. That's the key point. You know?
I guess that's a great example of, when people talk about communist China, they get a little mixed up because they say, well, it's communist, but it's still capitalist because, blah, blah, blah. And you have one example there where, it's not free. It's people still pay the toll as they do in the US, actually.
Yeah.
So it's a cool little example.
Yeah, the whole concept of free doesn't really work in China, There's another saying, if you give somebody something for nothing, that's the value they attach to it. Right. So, it's called the Communist Party, but if you translate it, it's Renmin. It just means the People's Party. They don't see anything sinister in it the way that it's portrayed in the West. But the Chinese people, they're not communists. I never met last time. When did I? There are very few Chinese people that, in relative terms, are members of the Communist Party. Well, I hope that answers your question. Thanks, Kevin. Where are you, Kevin?
I'm in Sainte-Thérèse near Montreal.
Okay, good enough. All right, you're a neighbor of Matt's then. Got it.
Yes.
We got Monty, who's got a loaded question. Go for it, Monty.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Olaf, I'm Baja, Mexico.
Wonderful. Okay.
Yeah. I just as an aside, I happen to be in Vietnam, so I kind of experienced this firsthand. All the drama and the bullshit around you know, the dice, not the rolling dice, but the theory that if we don't stop communism now,
Domino
that's
theory.
Hello?
Yeah,
The
yeah,
domino theory, yeah.
Yeah, the domino theory. But in any case, would you address a question for me and just clear this up? Because there's a common misconception in the West of this collectivist China that the state owns and controls all the business enterprises. But I heard recently that over 70% of the business enterprises in China are actually privately owned. Is that correct? And could you elaborate on that?
You've got to understand what the state sector is. I mean, firstly, I'm surprised. I would think it is more than 70%. I don't know that for certain. But I would imagine that in terms of private enterprises, no, I'm sure it would be more than 70%. That is most of the business. But understand what the state enterprises are. So, for example, all the Chinese airlines, they're state-owned, because you could fly from. I haven't been there since before COVID, but I mean, you could fly from Shanghai to Kunming, which is east to west. It's like flying from New York to New Mexico. It's about $50. So the airlines, they're state-owned. The banks are state-owned. Now, there's a few private banks in specialist areas, but they're insignificant. So the banks are state-owned. The railway system and transport systems are state-owned. So the Gautier, which is the high-speed train, that's state-owned. If you look at sort of some local enterprises are locally state-owned. The university system, there are some private universities there, but mainly the university system, the high school system, obviously energy, power, which has always been a huge thing. These are the things that everybody needs in their life. So what you do is you try and make them as efficient as possible and as cost effective as possible. Now, I remember 20 years ago when I had an office in London, and we employed a young Chinese girl as an intern. I mean, she was only about 16. So she was getting like, I don't know, we're giving her a couple of £100 a week, which isn't bad for an intern back then, about $300 or $400. It turns out she had to come in every day about an hour from outside London, and more than half her wages went towards a train ticket to get in and out of London. Now, how does that make any sense? Just from an economic point of view, that girl is working to live. She hasn't got money to go out in the evening. She hasn't got money to go and spend into the economy on clothes. But if you make sure that these Maslow's social hierarchy of needs are met cost effectively and efficiently, people have more money. They have more disposable income. They can buy more things into the economy where you get the multiplier effect. So that's what the state sector is in China. Obviously that country covers pension funds and all sorts of things. These are the things they need to protect from Western influence. So the state sector in China is not there to compete with the private sector. It's there to enable it. And it's worked. There's a lot of economic logic in it. Economics is a lot simpler than they would have us believe in the West. This really is not that simple. It's not that complicated. And they've demonstrated that. Does that answer your question, Monty?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much on that. Maybe if you could, a quick follow-up. I also understand the election system in China is based more on a meritocracy. In other words, the local people will vote for local government officials, and then the local government officials will elect the regional government officials, and the regional government officials elect the state government officials. In other words, it's more based on a meritocracy where you have an intimate association and knowledge of the local people you're electing, other than these national elections where it's mostly just politicized and run by money. Could you comment on that too, please?
Well, let's come back to that last part. But I mean, if you're talking about, yeah, they have their own form of local democracy. So, for example, local mayors in up to a point, village level, are elected by people. But let me tell you how democracy works there. So, a few years ago, I was living in the city of Jining in Shandong province. It's the hometown of Confucius. So they're building a factory just outside town. Well, it turns out the factory is a chemical factory, which wasn't declared, near a school, near a residential area. Thousands, and I mean thousands, of highly pissed off Chinese were demonstrating outside the local town hall. There was national TV cameras, local TV cameras, and people were saying what they thought. So that got national attention. The national government looked at it and they said, yeah, the people are right, no factory. That's how it works. So the idea that the Chinese are this sort of suppressed, downtrodden people who don't have a voice is nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Now, the people are nationalistic. They're proud to be Chinese. They're proud of the new China and the way it's risen, but they're not all saluting the communist flag or, idolizing the national government. They have a healthy cynicism towards government, the same as people in most countries do, even though they possibly have less reason for it. So on the national level, no, I mean, generally speaking, the premier will be elected by what essentially is the National Congress. And they have factions within China as well. But when you hear the Chinese people complaining about the government, it's generally more on a local level than a national level. But yes, I mean, to answer your question, which was the key question you raised about meritocracy, yes, it is. It's very hard to get into the civil service. It always has been. The civil service exam to identify the best and the brightest to bring the people into government. I mean, that's been going on since the days of Confucius, 2,600 years ago. So there's great status attached to working for the government in China. Yeah, it is a meritocracy. I mean, these are not idiots. These are not political cronies. These are people that believe in China. And she's made a lot of people in the West don't know what to make of Xi because he doesn't say much. A lot of people in China feel the same way. But every initiative that he has brought in has generally been applauded by the Chinese people. And there's been a lot of them. He came in, he said, we're going to end corruption. He did. He did. There's no more of it. I mean, if I was visiting another city in China on some business, any excuse whatsoever, the local trade official or whatever, he'd set up a dinner, that cost like $400 or $500 in those days. All his friends would be there, just an excuse for a dinner, and because they got a foreign visitor, they put it on the tab. I mean, when I had to redo my visa, I sent one of my girls down to the local immigration office with a bottle of Muay Thai. That's finished. There's no more dinners. They're locking people up. So he's done that. He also made some declarations about some of this kids spending too long online. He also hinted that he thought there was too much feminization of men on TV. They did that. So I think anybody that tells you that they know what's going on in the Chinese government is delusional. And I certainly wouldn't claim to know that. But if you look at the general trend of the way things run there, you can generally get a flavour for what's going on.
Solid. Kelly, do you want to ask your question, or do you want me to read it? Are you there, Kelly?
Yeah.
Hey, Kelly.
How you doing? Yeah, like you're talking about the negative things coming out of China, and there's one thing I just couldn't get out of my mind is the fentanyl question. Like, I talk to people, and I tend to say good things. I'm like a positive guy, and I get a lot of reactions from friends and stuff. It's like, well, China's they make all the fentanyl and they're bringing it over here and destroying our society. What's your view on all that?
Well, blaming China for America's drug problem, I think, is a bit of a stretch. Apparently, and I mean, look, I'll be honest with you. I mean, until a couple of years ago, I'd never heard of fentanyl. I'm sure most of us hadn't. If it's been, apparently it is being smuggled out of China and it is being smuggled into America. But that's not being done by the Chinese government. That's criminal gangs. I will tell you, the drug laws in China are the strictest in the world. Now, if you bear in mind the opium problem, courtesy of the West, that they struggled with for 100 years, that's the way they clamped down. Now, they had a problem a few years ago where Bing, which is ice, like, methamphetamine. If you get caught dealing drugs in China, you get executed. No ifs, ands, or well, you get executed for dealing drugs in China. They're not going to have the West flooding China with drugs again. So the criminal gangs that are involved in it, believe me, they're not working for the Chinese government. They're the enemy of the Chinese government too. So, I mean, yeah, the fentanyl crisis in America is just one of a number of very sad things that's going on there. It's sad that the society is in the state it's in, but they didn't need China for the opioid epidemic. That was all homegrown. So,
Yeah, that's a simple way of putting it. Thank you. My mother and grandmother are listening right now and wrote out a question.
Hello, Mum. Hello, Granny.
Hey, Mom, Oma, do you want to read ask your question to Eamon, or do you want me to read it?
You can read it, and I just want to say thank you so much for your presentation. It was amazing.
Oh, Oma. Vielen Dank, gnädige Frau.
Bitteschön.
Danke.
So the question is regarding the latest propaganda that Mom innately knows is wrong, but it's having trouble finding good answers to. Number one, first accusation: China is making war continue by loaning money to the U.S. to fight Russia. So that China is loaning money to the U.S., which is being used to then fight Russia, which is China's ally. I know if China called existing loans, the U.S. and the world would collapse, and China doesn't want that either. So it's new loans that I'm having trouble with understanding. And number two, China widely spread that is rallying people against China.
So you checked out for a second there, Matt. Read that last bit.
The second one was China owns 17 out of 19 of the cobalt mines in the Congo using slave labor. That's the second. And both things were used by senators in Senate during Senate hearings.
Well, China doesn't use slave labor, and I'm sure they don't own those cobalt mines in the Congo. I mean, what's happening in Africa, and I know Matt's and Cynthia both done a lot of excellent work on that, is Africa is completely moved away from colonization. So you've seen that now recently in Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, which were still essentially under the French imperial boot that are being kicked out. So you're going to see all kinds of, and we have seen all kinds of negative reporting on both Russia and China in Africa. But just bear in mind that the Africans like the Chinese and they like the Russians because they come in, they try to help, they don't talk down to them. And they don't try and interfere in their internal affairs. So I would put that one down as BS, actually, Omar. The other thing, the early part of that question was about China's lending money to America to fund the war in Ukraine. Well, China is dumping its treasury holdings as fast as it can without actually causing a panic. And China isn't the only one. I mean, that's a trend that's going on. So, look, America's going to print the money it needs for Ukraine, whether it's back to its reserves, you know, from Chinese bonds or anybody else. So I think that's kind of a mute point.
Cool. I like the answer, especially to the Congo one, where explaining it by the Africans don't have a problem with it. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
I think that Matt got knocked off and he's probably going to try to join again. So I'm kind of like taking over a little bit here.
Oh, okay, not a problem.
Okay. Helene had a question. Helene, are you there? Would you like to ask yourself or shall I read it?
I can ask it. So I was just wondering if you could just comment. Years ago, there was the problem with the dog food, with the melamine, and it kind of goes along Kelly's question as far as like the fentanyl. But do you know anything about like what happened, or is there any explanation? Because I had somebody throw that back at me about the Chinese. You know, if they're so wonderful, why did the melamine that was in that dog food, you know, kill so many dogs? And anyway, I just didn't know if you knew anything about it, and I just wanted to ask.
Yeah, I mean, that was, well, it was in the dog food. I also put, well, there was one company that were putting it in baby food. Okay, that's not the Chinese government. Okay, that's one guy who owns one company, put it in the baby food. Babies died. He got executed.
Oh.
Haven't heard melamine mentioned again.
No, not at all. I agree. I agree. Okay.
Yeah, that's a good way to address that.
Wow.
Magdalena.
Hi back. Hi. You're back.
Thank you so much, Magdalena, for,
No problem.
for picking it up.
So
you
Nick,
might have to do it again.
I think Nick should go next, and then Scott is having his hand up as well. Okay,
Great.
So because we skipped over Nick. Okay. Nick, are you there? Hello, Nick.
Might have lost Nick.
Okay, so then we're gonna go to Scott and see what hopefully Nick will join us.
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm Nick.
Oh, okay. Hi, Nick.
I couldn't unmute my thing fast enough.
Okay, you go, and then Scott.
Okay, I have a couple of questions. First off, this is the big one, but maybe you can make it as clear as you've made everything else. I can't see China, not knowing anything about China personally, I can't see China as one ideological monolith. It would seem to me that in any structure this vast, there've got to be different competing forces. Now, maybe the people in positions of authority now have it under control, but there has to be some kind of shifting ground in any kind of structure. So that was one part of that. And I guess the other part, which tags to that, is you've got a huge military in China as well. And it seems to me often in vast complexities, the military can have its own agenda. And that may be contradictory to the supportive in many cases, but it can be both supportive and destructive to the ideological mainstream of the Chinese government. So I didn't know how that played into it. The other thing is, when I think about the military and I think about China's infrastructure projects that it's doing, for instance, in Africa, with putting in the great rail systems and other things that they may have planned for the future, the military could be critical, it seems to me, in defending some of those structures, which makes their role far more complex and geopolitically dicey, because I just can't believe that competing forces, let's put it that way, are just going to let China do whatever it wants anywhere just because certain countries say, well, sure, come in here and do it. It's for our own best interests if you do. So the next part of that question is, what happens when the bill comes due? I mean, the Chinese are brilliant business people. They ain't giving anything away for free. So who pays this off when the bill comes due? And then my last comment is in terms of medical care. This is what I've heard from my Chinese buddies who are acupuncturists who work in the US now. One of the things that they've heard from their buddies who are still in China is that, yes, everybody gets free care. But if you want really good free care, you're paying the doctor under the table. Now, maybe that's changed in the last 10 years. But you know, we have versions of that here too. You know, if you're well healed, you're going to get probably much better medical care than if you're on a state insurance policy. But we're talking about significantly poorer care unless you pay the doctor under the table. So I'm just going to leave it at that. I think I've probably asked too many things.
Okay, well, thanks, Nick. Your first question about it not being monolithic and there has to be competing forces. Yes, there are factions in China. If you recall, for example, Jack Ma, who is sort of a Chinese version of Bill Gates, he heads up Alibaba. He came out and made some negative statements about the Chinese banking system, and he was told to sit down, enjoy his money, and shut up. The point about it is Jack Ma is a creation. He was a school teacher. He is just a front for the Alibaba group, which is owned by the Zhang family out of Shanghai. The Zhang family are a very powerful family. They produced several mayors of Shanghai, one premier, Jiang Zemin, in the early 2000s. So they are one very powerful faction, very powerful, very rich family. Another family is the Xi family. They own the Wanda group. So they are absolutely, the Shanghai faction and the Beijing faction have sort of been at odds always. But in terms of the central government, any problems that they have in this regard, we generally don't see. That's the first thing. The second thing with the Chinese military, and it needs to be understood, is that China now has significant military technology and power. They have all of these hypersonic missiles that the Russians and the Iranians, the Indians, and I'm sure soon to be the North Koreans have that the West don't have. But if you look at that bloc, if you look at Russia, China, Iran, all of their military is defensive in nature. None of them have a military that's geared up to go and invade other countries. None of them. And I'm sure most of those countries would rather not spend as much on their military if they weren't under threat from the empire. That's the second thing. And bear in mind, China has one naval base in Djibouti. It's there on request of the government there to protect against pirates. Russia has two overseas temporary military bases, one in Kazakhstan and one in Kyrgyzstan. And again, they're both there in response to coup attempts by the West. neither of these powers have any empirical ambitions, and they're a check with each other. So the Chinese military is not going to overturn the government. China cannot afford chaos. That's not going to happen. The third part of your question, I think, if I haven't missed it, was about debt, Nick. Is that correct? Nick still there?
Yes, I am still here. Yeah, I think the part of the question that you answered about the military, my concern wasn't the Chinese military as a world aggressor. That's not their history.
No.
But my concern would be as a military grows stronger, has more capability, it can have its own agenda vis-a-vis the government and power structures.
Yeah.
So my thought is the shifting sands, where you have a military operation that is always critical to a country, that then has increasing power in the politics of that particular country. That's what I mean by it's not, is it necessarily one ideological monolith? I mean, there's always shifts and evolution.
No, of course not. You're not going to have 1.3 billion people all see things exactly the same way. But in terms of, is the country divided? No, it isn't. It's all moving in the right direction. It's all moving in the same direction because that direction has proved to work. So I wouldn't spend too long worrying about the Chinese military. Look, what I will do is answer your question about that. The first thing is the way that China is financing the Belt and Road, it is not a debt trap. It is not a debt trap. If you look at the amount of countries that are involved and who those countries are that are willingly signing on to the Chinese model, trust me, they've all met the IMF and the World Bank. They don't need any education whatsoever in what is a debt trap. China, a few months ago, they forgave 23 loans to 17 African nations, totaling in the billions. They never said anything not to embarrass them. That came out elsewhere. Debt is not the problem. Debt cancellation is going to be a very big issue in the near future. Because for these emerging global south countries now to move away from the dollar and move to this new Chinese system, that can work very, very quickly. History proved what you can do if you have public banking, how you can turn around an economy very, 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 very quickly. But you can't do anything when you're saddled with all this IMF debt. So debt cancellation is going to be a very big part of what's coming up. The Chinese system is not about creating debt slavery. That's not that model at all. People use the example of Sri Lanka. Okay, now Sri Lanka essentially are under IMF control now. What happened in Sri Lanka? Well, firstly, the reason why Sri Lanka had severe economic problems was the World Economic Forum bribed them to move to this net zero, no fertilizers, Agenda 2030, and all their crops failed, people starved, the economy was hurting. Now, Sri Lanka came to China to build this port, this world-class port in Sri Lanka, which would have made a huge difference to their economy. The project was initially Canadian. The Canadians went to the Sri Lankans and they proposed a port. The Sri Lankans said, yeah, that's a great idea. We're situated ideally, you know, a world-class port could benefit our economy enormously. The Canadians backed out and they went to the Chinese, and the Chinese said, yes, we'll do it. The cost for the port was about $3 billion. They gave Sri Lanka another $2 billion to build support infrastructure, which they never did. They used it to pay their IMF debt. China has not taken control of the port. It's managing it because the Sri Lankans are essentially incompetent. But it has not taken or snatched that as an asset. But here's the key. Sri Lanka owes $55 billion. 5 of it owes to China, for which it got a world-class port. What did it get for the other 50 billion? Debt. More debt, piled on more debt, piled on more debt. That's the difference between productive capitalism and financial capitalism. You know, you can use public banking to create the money to build something productive. Financial capitalism is just moving money around. Nobody needs any education in what that is. So, look, I hope that's answered your question. Don't worry about the army. They're fine. And the Chinese model is about developing prosperity everywhere. It wants everybody to be prosperous, including America, because that's better to do business with everybody, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Opportunities, right? That's the way it is. Now, the one flaw in China's model is that it's great, but if your model is based on prosperity and all your partners are broke, that's a problem, and that's kind of where we are right now. But I thank you for your question, Nick. Questions.
Can I just ask you one last thing? Because this is an argument that I have with friends, and I never have anything to back up your point of view. Can you recommend something I could read or a resource I could go to give me some kind of documentation for your particular point of view? Otherwise, all I'm going to do is to repeat your point of view. Have you written something? Is there some resource I can go to get this?
Well, you asked a lot of questions that covered a lot of ground. So I'm not sure there's one resource you can go to that's going to answer all your questions, Nick. But let me think on that. And
thank you very much.
I'll see what I can get you. Thank you, Nick.
Same here. And by Nick, this is Maureen, right?
Yeah, it is.
Hey, Maureen. In the future, you can always change your name so there'll be less confusion. But send me an email, and I'll shoot you some resources as well. Eamon will also be able to send me some stuff that I'll shoot your way.
That would be really, really helpful. I'd really appreciate it.
Okay.
Thanks, Matt.
No worries. So Madeline, you'd said that Scott was up next, right? I think so. So Scott.
Correct. Scott, yes.
Okay. Let's go with Scott and then
hello.
Shannon.
Okay, hello. What a great dialogue. Thanks very much for all the information. That's great to hear. Some new points that I haven't heard before. I'm coming to you live from Vancouver. I don't know if you can see this. And then down by the Falls Creek, everybody. Beautiful day in Vancouver. And it's the Asian gateway to the Pacific Century, I think. We've got Sun Yat-sen's garden here in Vancouver. Have you ever been to it?
Well, I've been to Vancouver, Scott. I don't believe I ever ventured to Sun Yat-sen's garden. No, in fact, I'll be honest, I never heard of it.
Okay, well, next time you're in town, come on, stop by.
Yeah,
you'd love it. It's I was pleasantly surprised by it, but just wanted to ask, modern China is really following in the footsteps of Sun Yat-sen's economic policies and his philosophy for national development. Can you add anything that you know about in China where his memory and is being revived and celebrated, and do you think that we should do something to do that in the United States and Canada to build upon and counteract the British imperial agenda to drive Canada and China apart?
Well, the first part of that, strangely enough, Sun Yat-sen's not really spoken about, talked about, or credited enough, I think. I mean, he was like a lot of people. I mean, he was very credible and well-intentioned by all accounts, but his party was the Kuomintang, and when he died, you know, the Kuomintang essentially became the party of the oligarchs, and you know, there wasn't much happening to freedom from the century of shame. So his memory is, it's not lauded in the same way that some of the others are. Hu Yaobang, Zhou Enlai in particular. But no, since you pointed out, that's a good point. I can honestly say that no, he doesn't get the attention that probably he deserves. I'm not quite sure why that is. And the second part of that was
Do you
about
think? Go ahead.
Yeah, it was, sorry, it was about trying to counter the narrative on China.
Yeah, trying to what could we do as Canadians and Americans to foster the memory and revive Sun Yat-sen and the true legacy that he provided to help Canadians understand modern day China and build new ties.
If people are still buying into this anti-China narrative, trying to say anything positive about China will get a pushback from them. I mean, you know, I had an experience, Scott, a couple of New Year's Eves ago, and I was around a friend of a friend's house, and I was sitting there talking to this really clued up Australian guy. Seemed like a real red pillar. He was talking about COVID, the Australian government, the World Economic Forum. I was a soul butter. And then at the end, he said, but we got to do something about Chinese aggression. And it's like, whoa, you know, example, please. One doesn't exist, but, you know, look, there's certain lies, like the little lies people can spot. The big lies, they get away with. So, you know, when you're talking about Russia and China, even people who think they're switched on, there's this ambient propaganda that's just there all the time. And they seem happy to accept that this time, you know, the government's telling them the truth. Go figure. So, you know, and you're taking it to a different, you know, people have got to be ready to listen to the truth. But before people are prepared to listen to any truth or anything positive about China, the history, the civilization, the first thing they got to acknowledge is that they don't believe the narrative, you know, and trying to wake people up, you know, by engaging them on any particular subject, like China, trying to say it's all bullshit about China, and they'll push back. Don't start there, you know. The question has got to be, look, are you a critical thinker? Do you believe what you're being told? Do you believe the government? Do you believe the mainstream media? Get them to acknowledge the lie before you try and introduce some truth to them, because otherwise you're not going to go anywhere. But yeah, I'm glad to see that. I'm glad to see that you're familiar with Sun Yat-sen. That's actually the way you pronounce it, and you know, people don't know very much about it, and it's, you know, I use this example. I mean, if you want to understand the American Civil War, the Library of Gettysburg, there's about 40,000 different books, you know, and they're contemporary reports from people who lived through it. So if you want to understand the American Civil War, all the resources there to get first-hand accounts, you can know everything about it, right? How many of those books were written in Chinese? Not many. So if you want to look at the totality of Chinese history and what was going on, you need sort of contemporary accounts. So, I mean, I've got Zhou Enlai's book, Wang's book. These people lived through it. But if you want to go further back than that, you really have to, you know, study Chinese history in its original format. And it's Chinese history that teaches you about the culture and the mindset. And, that the curiosity necessary to achieve that understanding, really doesn't exist in the West. They just seem to be happy to, absorb whatever they're being told on the subject.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely a lack of humility that prevents people from allowing their minds to even just go there. And ironically, if people would take the time to actually look at what is being expressed by China now and what Sun Yat-sen was doing, they would learn a lot more about their own, what was destroyed within our own better traditions that have allowed us to turn into an empire today. We'd be able to understand and recapture some of that which made us good and which China emulated through the 1911 revolution and through the Belt and Road Initiative today. It's all part of the same world history that people could really discover a lot about.
Yeah.
Shannon. Yeah. Do you want to say something on that, or should I go to Shannon?
Well, let me just follow on with that point. The Chinese make the point that there's never been a case in history where democracy hasn't turned into an oligarchy in about 20 minutes. Didn't even take that long in Russia when the Soviet Union fell. Because in a democracy, there is nobody there with the long-term interest of the country and the nation at heart to protect the people. Now, if you want to go back to European history, I mean, we had some truly bad monarchs, but it was only the monarchs that could stand up to the aristocratic class, which later became the moneyed aristocracy. So, going into World War I, we still had 8 empires. By the time we came out of World War II, there was one left. There's no one to protect the people from the oligarchy. And democracy always turns into oligarchy. That's why they love it so much.
Good point. Shannon.
Hi, thank you, Eamon, for a great presentation. I just have and thank you, Matt, for doing this. I have a really quick question about real estate. They have ghost cities all over that have been built all around the country. And I just wondered, is that in anticipation for mass movement of Chinese people all around China? And if so, why? And if that's not the case, then why do they have so many literally empty cities being built over the last, 20, 30 years? Thank you.
That's a good question, Shannon. Thank you. I don't have any doubt that they have some very poorly thought out property projects in China, but very few. What you're seeing is, now I'll give you an example. The city I was living in before, Shandong Jining, I mean, one of my staff, she lived in an area of town where it was all very, very old housing. And they were rediverting and they were putting a highway through. So it was a big project. Everybody that lived in the village got rehoused. Now, they were generally smaller, older houses. And for example, the girl that worked for me, her family got 3 new 120 square meter apartments. Her mum and dad got one, her brother got one, and she got one. The city that they moved into was about 5 or 6 miles away. And it had been standing for about 1.5 years, 2 years before they moved in. So they built that in preparation for where they're actually going to be relocating people from. Yeah. So they take these photographs of these cities before anybody's moved in. But if you go back in 2 years, you'll find it's full. So a lot of that is just negative propaganda, Sharon. I mean,
okay, thank you.
Yeah, I don't doubt that some of them are real, but very much in the minority.
Magdalena.
Yes, hi. Sorry, my phone in the back is ringing. At my school, we had a lot of teachers from India, and whenever the question about China came up, especially in connection with the different infrastructure projects and how China is promoting this in Africa and so on, they would always have this response, oh, yeah, but it's just going to be like the IMF. China is going to have also high interest rates. And I know you touched on this a little bit beforehand, but I wanted to raise this again because this is such a brainwashing, I think if I would call it correctly, of these Indian teachers that they had that response.
Well, look, the Indian people are subjected to their version of the same propaganda we get. All the facts will show you what China's financial behavior and its model is, and its relationship with the people in those countries. It is not a debt trap. That is actually not the objective of doing it. IMF loans, the objective is the debt. This is not the objective here. The objective is investment and development and growth. So, if somebody can bring some facts to that contradicts it, I'll happily talk about that. But frankly, that's just part of the narrative.
Thank you.
Welcome, Otto.
Joe 90.
Sinister looking silhouette there.
Sure, he's got a heart of gold. Oh, there. Oh, the silhouette has ended. Okay, no, it's back. Hey, Joe, you're on mute. Hey, Joe. Yeah, you have to take yourself off of mute so we can hear you. See your mouth moving. But yeah, you on the Zoom screen it says mute, unmute on the bottom left hand side. That's where the option usually is for the mute icon. So you have to click it to unmute, or write down your question. You could write it down in the chat box too. Yeah, that's what you'll do. Okay. All right, good. On that issue, Eamon, while Joe's writing out his question, Evergrande, right now everybody's speaking about how this is finally the fulfillment of the prophecies of the collapse of the Chinese economy. And sure enough, there's incompetence there, certainly. I think could you speak a little bit towards that assessment that we're hearing all the time regarding the Chinese real estate bubble popping, Evergrande going upside down and taking down the Chinese economy, and where are the fallacies? Can you clarify that whole topic a bit?
Specifically with Evergrande, I mean, they're a very good or a very big company, and they did countless projects all over China, and they were very profitable when they did the business that they understood, which was property development. They made the mistake a lot of business people make, which is they think they've got golden balls and they can turn that to anything. So they decided, what a great idea, let's get in the electric vehicle industry. That's what destroyed them. The Chinese government came in and essentially said, look, those families, homes are for living in, they're not for speculating. Those families that bought or put deposits down on houses will get them. The general public won't lose a dime. If you invested in Evergrande, that's capitalism. You've lost your money. So they bailed out the people. They didn't bail out the corporation. And the corporation has assets. I mean, huge assets. But there's definitely a downturn in the Chinese economy. There's definitely been a downturn in the property market. Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah, their economy is not doing great, but you've got to bear in mind that the way their economy is structured, they have tools and things they can do are not available to the West.
Thank you. Joe, I noticed that your mute appears to be off now. So can you speak? Joe? No, okay. All right. I will let people have one last chance to ask Eamon a question before we round it out. I have actually one more question that I have in mind that I'd like you to expand upon. While people are okay, Kevin has a follow-up question, but let me. Too late, Kevin. I'm going to ask mine first, and then I'll ask. Then you can give yours. Or Jack Ma. So you were mentioning the disruptive tactics of Jack Ma a little bit, and the Shanghai clique. I had recently been looking into the battle against the financialization of the economy, which had a really it's an essay by a Chinese economist that took a long 80-year focus, which was nice. A lot of things were introduced that I didn't know about regarding the 1950 economic reforms that brought a supply-based, productive type of economic paradigm into play in China that dealt with measuring how much money you could have in circulation based upon how much grain millet was being produced. There was about a basket of 5 or 6 goods. And if you could produce a little bit more than a certain allocated quantity, you could the government was permitted, or at least encouraged, to emit 1 extra renminbi for every like 12 kilograms per capita per square kilometer of millet or something like that, which is an interesting way of thinking about it. And you see a sort of return to this idea of a new market basket based upon measurable productive commodities being discussed today as part of the BRICS orientation for a new economic structure. That's very interesting. But then in the context of Jack Ma, within this paper, they were going through Jack Ma's efforts to try to create a bit of an economic coup by allowing his ant group to have all of the privileges of a bank, but not being a bank, not having to submit to any of the regulation that the typical banks have to submit to, because technically it's a tech company, you know. And this was again a really calling for a bit of a coup, because his banks, his Alipay, other financial loan operations have been accused of predatory lending to the people of China, resulting in massive amounts of debt, especially among millennials, unpayable debts at high interest, other things that involve just encouraging a consumerism and speculative mode of thinking and being in the culture in China, which is really not conducive to the survival of China. So that had to be taken down. And I was wondering if you could say anything more about like what was Jack Ma exactly? Like, how did this guy go from being a teacher to being this multi-billionaire World Economic Forum operative? Do you know anything more about like how this phenomenon happened? What handles him? What manages this guy?
Well, I mean, how did they create Bill Gates? How did they create Mark Zuckerberg? If you want to destabilize a country, then what you do is you create an oligarch class. The oligarchy is the Trojan horse for the capitalists. So, I mean, Matt, you've written about it extensively, about, you know, how the City of London created this oligarch class in America to disrupt the system, and it worked. It's still working. Now, Jack Ma essentially was criticizing the Chinese banking system, but you got to understand, most people have no idea who Jack Ma is, but believe me, the Chinese government understand whose interests he represents. And this Shanghai faction led by the Zhang family, they've always been treated with suspicion from the Beijing factions, which were more plentiful. So the Shanghai faction, like the Zhang family, I mean, they go back to major collaboration with the foreign powers, you know, but they've survived, they've endured through generations and different leadership. Funny how that happens. To talk about the foundation of the economy, what you described about linking the amount of money in circulation to certain key indicator products, that's what Benjamin Franklin explained to the British when they asked how they managed to run their economy so successfully. Keep the amount of money in circulation enough, you know, and available for business to be able to transact, but not enough to destabilize prices. You know, and it worked. If you looked at what you got for $1 in 1800, You still got the same thing for $1 in 1900. Did you know that?
No.
Yeah, it's a fact. So yeah, if you're basing it on the economic model of the 50s, you've got to bear in mind that's a very complicated thing because they were skewing the numbers. Mao was skewing the numbers to hide the fact that he was taking the produce from collective farming and sending it to Russia to pay for the nuclear program. So the figures from that time absolutely can't be trusted. But yeah, I mean, look, it's commodities that have value now as paper money has been seen to be, well, increasingly worthless, particularly the dollar. But yeah, it's all about commodities. I mean, China really has now got a grip on commodities. And it's the BRIC collective here that's become the commodity powerhouse. Energy, natural resources, raw materials. It's got all of that. It's also got the biggest consumers.
Right on. Kevin, I'll give you that last question.
All right. Actually, I have two. Let's start with the first one. So lately, there's been a lot of buzz regarding the latest cell phone by Huawei, right? With the, I think it's the 40 nanometer chip, and it came to, I think, the forefront in the news that the semiconductor industry is going to be a huge point of friction on the geopolitical scene, right? So I wondered if you had any comment on that part and when it comes to the semiconductor industry, and also, are there, in your view, other markets in China that will eventually create this sort of friction with the West also?
Well, yeah, the semiconductor and tech issue, I mean, that has been a source of friction since, well, at least since Trump got it. So, I mean, he banned, and again, look, I'm not a techie, so I might be using the wrong terminology here, but he banned the sale of high-end chips to China. So that immediately cost, this is what, 4 years ago now, immediately cost America about $50 billion in sales. And increasingly it was identifying different kinds of chips that it was putting sanction on. So China's developed its own. It really didn't have any choice. Now, some of they haven't got the full range quite up to the same standard, but that's not going to take in 10 minutes. So, yeah, I mean, again, it's just another example of sanctions backfiring. But you know, from what I understand, the Huawei phone is just as good as the Apple phone for most parts. But the problem with the Apple phone today, and that's why they're being banned in China, is this new technology which employing AI, it takes like 4 updates a minute of whatever you're doing. It is spying on you in the worst possible way. We had a presentation, one of the members of the group, and all of this sounds like science fiction to me, but apparently the definition on the iPhone camera is such that it could literally take your DNA from your retina. Yeah.
Seriously?
So government officials in China are not allowed to have them anymore because essentially the thing is the scanner. It's just using this AI and it's taking updates on your phone, what you're doing, what you're talking, like 3 times a minute or something. It's horrifying. So, yeah, look, if they're in a tech war, they've already lost. And China's development in other areas of science and technology, they've just leapfrogged generations, and they're continuing to do that.
Right. Well, the eye scanner thing is, I never heard about that. That's
What's that?
The eye scanner thing that you just mentioned. I never heard about that, so that's quite surprising. I'm gonna look into this a little bit more. My second question.
I mean,
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'll go in with my second and last question. It's in regards to the gold, actually, the gold market, and it's often said that the Chinese own most of its gold through its people, right? And you mentioned something about the Shanghai faction versus the Beijing faction, and I think the as far as the gold market is concerned, all the exchange is based in Shanghai, and from following people like Tom Longo and Vince Lancy, they talk a lot about this kind of, I won't say cooperation, but talk between JP Morgan and the Shanghai exchange when it comes to the gold market. So do you have anything to say in regards to that? I mean, I don't know much about that. I'm just learning, but
I think there's a lot more context to that, Kevin. I mean, first and foremost, the world price of gold is set every morning in London by the Rothschilds, and that's been the case for at least 150 years or so. That's one thing. The other thing, JP Morgan is, and always has been, a fund for the Rothschilds. JP Morgan, going back 150 years, he was a Rothschilds agent. So what is interesting now, because that's always been fixed, so the price of silver has been suppressed, the price of gold has been maintained. But there's a new metal exchange now that's working out of Russia, and that's going to completely rewrite the rules. To a certain extent, I think the gold discussion is kind of irrelevant. In terms of back in, for example, a gold-backed digital yuan as a payment method, that makes some sense. But if it's China or Russia that's issuing a digital payment system, it doesn't necessarily need to be backed by gold, because there's other countries that want to join this system that are not going to have gold, but they've got other commodities. So, and I mean, Matt, I know you've done some great work, this sort of Glazhev model, where, you attach value to something of real value rather than this, the fiat. That's all that's necessary. And I don't think there's going to be another reserve currency. There's not going to be one reserve currency, certainly not one that is going to be dominated by, one particular country. So this is all very, very positive. I don't pay a huge amount of attention to the gold markets because it's always been manipulated. I'm interested to see how that changes now they don't have a monopoly on setting the price of precious metals.
Yeah, well said. I think Kevin's satisfied. Now, Joe thinks that he has solved his problem with his microphone. So, Joe.
Oh, right, Joe.
Ooh.
Maybe not.
Hey, Joe. Well, there is sound coming into your mic, but it is of a weird amplitude. You almost sound like a chipmunk. It's a bit weird.
Yeah, I was going to go with Minnie Mouse.
Is that better?
Oh, that's so much better. Good job. Yes.
Is that better? Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. My point was, I think Eamon said earlier, he was kind of suggesting that any democracy changes naturally or unnaturally into an oligarchy. And by implication, I was assuming maybe you were suggesting that China, therefore, is something else. And how could you convince people to give up democracy, for the Chinese model if you're offering them not democracy, if that makes sense?
Well, yeah, I'm not suggesting anybody dumps anything, but I mean, the fact is, the democracy has failed the West. I think it's fair to say that. The reality is, democracy is too easy to hijack. That's why they're always talking about liberal democracy. They love it because essentially it's no such thing. What it is oligarchy. Now, that's what we've got. It's not even well disguised anymore. They used to be better at covering it up. So, we have to be very careful if we're talking. I mean, we're looking at a systematic crash because every aspect of the Western system is flawed and it's imploding on itself. But we have to be very careful about what comes next. I mean, Edmund Burke wrote about the French Revolution when it was in its early days. And it's like, well, all this ideology is well and good, but what comes next? So tearing down everything and going back to year zero, I mean, that's not an option. The reality, bad as it may be right now, you can still go and put petrol in your car, turn your tap on and get water, and still get electricity. If those functions are no longer there, you've got nothing whatsoever to hold it together. So in the West, I mean, we have to be very careful about this revolution. Whatever the flaws of our system, it's better than no system at all.
Yeah.
The problem with democracy is we don't have a system of oversight or accountability, and we seem to be too comfortable with that. So in terms of, is there a Western alternative to democracy that would work? Not a good one, no.
No, the offer would be fascism.
I mean, my people ask, should we be optimistic? Should we be pessimistic? I am optimistic with the general trend of mankind that we are moving in the right direction, where 85% of the world's population is moving away from empire. We're living through the end of empire. For the first time in history, we're going to see a world without empire. That's exciting. And I'm not worried about the 85% of the world that has already made that decision. And I'm very optimistic about the future generally. But when it comes down to the Western world, we don't have a plan B. They're just pushing ahead with this final push, which is this absurd Agenda 2030, which is, for any number of reasons, isn't going to work. It's absurd. It was absurd in its context. It was absurd in its makeup, in its concept. And it's failing everywhere because it's being exposed. Now, they are trying to step it up and move that agenda forward, which is a sign of panic. But what we need is change without chaos in the West. And the problem we have, with the possible exception of Trump in America, we don't want to go there. But I don't see any leadership in any Western country that gives me any optimism at all. There are some political parties, for example, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, that looks like it's gonna win, but the system itself, I'm afraid I don't have any optimism for. But there have to be functions of government that are maintained. That's the problem. So revolutions, there's no doubt we need change, but that change has to be managed, and there's an absolute lack of any leadership. Now, again, like leadership, we have to be careful here. People that go looking for leaders usually end up with masters. History teaches us that. But there are some people that are speaking the truth, but sadly there's not enough people listening right now, and that's another conversation. I do believe we have critical mass. I do believe there are enough people that are not happy with what's going on. I think sometimes we underestimate that number because we're using some metric to say, well, this guy's awake and this guy's still got his head up his ass. Well, it depends what the metric is we use for assessing that. And it was earlier, I think I was talking to Kevin. I mean, you cannot wake people up by engaging them on a particular subject because you'll just get the pushback. The main thing is this: do you think you're getting the truth? Do you believe the government? Do you believe the media? Because anybody that's got any cognitive abilities has got to say, well, I'm not sure there's any of these institutions that I trust anymore. I don't trust the government. I don't trust the financial sector. I don't trust the justice system. I don't trust academia. I don't trust the medical industry. So what do you have then? You have this noble anarchy where people just refuse to comply. So I don't know. I think the rest of the world is well on its way to sorting itself out and has a bright future, but I despair for the Western world for all the reasons that I just said. And did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Like I often tell people, we don't know exactly what the immediate future is gonna hold. We know that it's definitely going to be a character building experience. And that's one thing you can know for sure. People's character will be tested, and it is through crisis that we grow. We don't grow through being comfortable. And there is definitely a hunger and a thirst for truth now that I've never seen before to this extent. So that's all that you can work with. That's definitely something you can work with, and it gives me a lot of solace and optimism, as Eamon said as well, knowing that we have, for the first time in history, as far as I could tell, such a coalition of major powers representing civilizational states, not just nation states, but real civilizational forces, which are taking stock of the historic lessons, that are treating like China. If you look at the Chinese shows, even you can go on Netflix and watch some of the Chinese programming from Chinese TV shows and things like that. Or even on YouTube, they make a lot of these shows available. What is actually cool for young people to watch involve storylines that involve the Zhou dynasty, the Silk Road period, the battles and the court intrigues of the Tang dynasty, and they're really great stories, sometimes really long, like 500 hours, like these shows can go on for a long time. But unlike the West, which most of the shows, the movies that we have access to, especially the younger generation, they're designed to make you a worse person. That's the design. It's a dumber, worse person with wrong passions. Whereas in China, like, the stories are both engaging, but they're making you more insightful. They're making you more spiritually connected to the people who lived and fought 2,000 or more years ago, 3,000 years ago, and they're helping you understand how the world actually works today. Like, they're creating a more knowledgeable citizenry capable of being qualified for self-direction, sovereignty, and the only way democracy is ever going to work is if you have a culture of excellence, that is not mediocre, that is not degenerate, but a culture that encourages people to take ownership for their family, the effects of their decisions, and the responsibility that they have to defend the freedoms that they have.
Yeah, I think people don't need truth; they need hope, not false hope, in kind of Barack Obama, not the Barack Obama type of hope.
It dances together. It dances together. Hope and knowledge.
People have a certain inbuilt maybe reluctance to know the truth, maybe in some ways, but hope is much more productive, I think. That's awesome.
Can I jump in there about? It was Benjamin Franklin, I think, who said that the one essential thing for a functional democracy is an informed electorate. And that's what we don't have. And this is a conversation Matt and I were having the other day. People cannot employ critical thinking skills. They can't tell the difference between an opinion, a fact, or a belief, or by extension, a lie. So if you watch the news reporting on any of the mainstream, identify the opinion, identify the fact, if there is indeed a fact in there. But the lies are the most insidious, because the big lie is give you a little fact, but it's a lie of omission because it lacks context, so it can't be understood. Like, Russia invaded Ukraine. Well, yeah, but how far do we want to go back to understand that? Burning to death a bunch of citizens in the Crimea, the Minsk agreement, the fact that they've been, when you lack context, now that's the problem. we need people to be able to think critically, but if you don't have at least a basis of information on which to compare it, if you don't have these basic facts about what's going on, how do you employ critical thinking? I mean, if you don't understand the forces at work here with China and Russia and Ukraine and the US, how are you supposed to think critically when you see a news report? You don't have the skills to employ critical thinking. So people cannot tell the difference. They don't know what's real and what isn't. And this is Orwell, you know? When you can get people to say things they know not to be true, very soon people can't tell the difference between truth and fiction. Right? That's unfortunately where we are. So, like, I love the idea of democracy. I've never seen it work very well. Again, it turns into oligarchy, but it cannot possibly work unless you have an informed, educated electorate. And as Thomas Jefferson said, the cost of freedom is eternal vigilance. And in the West, people fell asleep at the wheel.
Well said.
That's the legacy we're leaving. That's the price we pay.
Yeah. Eamon, the remedy to this is certainly discovery, truth seeking, and we have to take matters into our own hands. I think a lot of people have discovered that, especially in the last 3 years. But this afternoons like this, I think, are really great testaments to this love of truth, this pursuit of knowledge that we all need to have if we are going to be sovereign citizens capable of taking responsibility in some measure to varying amplitudes for our future and for our society. So I thank you for that. And everyone should know that Eamon is a part of and a leading figure within a very interesting group. Cynthia and I have spoken at weekly meetings of this group called Century Real. Did I just pronounce that right, or is it wrong? Did I mispronounce it?
Well, I think you gave a little bit of a Spanish touch there. It's not real as in river, it means real. Samui Real, based on the island of Koh Samui in Thailand, yes. Right
on. So this is a very interesting group. It has been growing over the past couple of years. Like I said, we've spoken to it. And Alex Craner, a good friend, is also a frequent lecturer. Eamon speaks a lot. And it's every Wednesday for us here in the, Western Hemisphere. It's every Wednesday. For me, it would be in the early morning around 7 a.m. So if people are early bloomers and would like to listen in live, Eamon, how can people, who do they write to access or to receive an invitation to listen in and to participate in the weekly events?
Well, it's unfortunately it's an uncommon time, and we start at 7 p.m. now, so that would actually be 8 a.m. in the morning for you, Matt. So, maybe we'll get Cynthia on again with that in mind one of these days. Samui Real, SAMUIREAL.org. If you go, there's a website. It explains the principles of the group community. And we generally have 50 to 60 people in physical attendance, and we're joined from people all over the world, from Argentina to Japan, Canada, if Matt can get up. So it's a good thing, because community, everybody talks about community, but what does it look like? I mean, this community is wonderful, but the shit hits the fan. None of you are any good to me. Community means local, and we're doing, we have education programs that we're doing here for homeschool kids. And it's, following on from what we were talking about the knowledge, people don't have a broad base of knowledge to enable critical thinking. So we got kids at the time they're 15 or 16. It's great. Now you're going to focus on 3 subjects to the exclusion of everything else. And what do you want to do with your life? How the hell are they supposed to know? But what I do know is education is not preparing children for the world that they're coming into. So our program is, there's probably a curriculum of 30 seminars, 1 hour, and they cover things like critical thinking, logic, the ancient philosophers, true history, a whole range of things that now a student is going to be able to sit through, have a fun, informative lecture, ask questions. At the end of it, on a subject like critical thinking or logic, they will be able to talk about it informatively. So rather than specialize in one or two subjects that are not going to be any good to them later in life, you give them this broad base of knowledge. Then you can apply critical thinking and reasoning. So we're doing a lot of things in the community, and we've been working with other people around the world to show them how we did it, because when I found the group about 2 years ago, I was amazed what they'd accomplished and how they'd managed to keep it together, because I've been involved in groups before, like Scholars for 9/11 Truth, and it falls apart. But there was a mission statement, a set of values that was established with the group that has enabled it to keep together. And I think there's been nearly 600 people through our meetings physically. So it's a good thing. But samurireal.org, if you go there, you'll find our website. Just fire off an email and you'll get notifications. The talks that we have, well, occasionally we'll have somebody like Matt or Alex Craner or Cynthia talk. It's mainly people within the group who, we have a very, very accomplished group. So last week there was a talk on critical thinking and analysis, why people come, much like what I was just talking about. I think next week it's from the Library of Alexander to Kahana, Convenient Fires and Disaster Capitalism. One after that, I think, is going to be on the Frankfurt School. We got another talk coming up on collective consciousness and energy vibrations, which is fascinating, and it's not really anything I knew anything about. So we got it's kind of like TED Talks with the truth, if you like. But it's meant a lot to an awful lot of people. And in the 2 years that I've been going, it's really been a study. I could write a paper on it about seeing people coming in at various stages of their awakening process. It really has been a study. So, yeah, I mean, by all means, connect with the group if you get a chance. It's not official or publicised yet, but we're hoping to have Matt and Cynthia out here for a conference next year in April, which should be fun. 3-day conference with lots of fun guests, bouncy castles and ice cream and all sorts of things. It'll be a ball.
Anywhere there's bouncy castles and ice cream, I'm there.
Oh, yeah, man.
That's made the Freedom Convoy work. All right. So, Eamon, thank you so much. If anybody, like I said, wants to get in touch with Samurireal, the link is now in the chat box, and when this is going to be on YouTube, go to the description box and you'll find the link there as well. If you want to arrange to fly to Thailand for their conference next year, you can talk about that with Eamon and his friends down in Thailand. Thank you, everyone, for taking this Sunday afternoon, Monday morning, Sunday night, wherever you are. And next week, we've got something planned regarding, let me just see here quickly. Next week, next Sunday, Rising Tide Foundation meeting will be with Bruce Lero, author of Promethean Psychology, on the Frankfurt School, how the left was corrupted into wokeness, the difference between the authentic left that would actually fight empire and get their leaders overthrown by the CIA versus the thing that we see today taking control of our school system. So that'll be a fun thing that'll, I think, dovetail one of the presentations in Thailand in a couple of weeks too, which would be a fun little, I'm going to watch them both together and see the treatment.
Yeah. Well, the most important thing about that subject is you've got to you turn on your television, particularly if you're not going to leftist TV, and you will see somebody denigrating and laughing at and ridiculing the alphabet mafia. Never does anybody ever go to the root and talk about what its agenda is, where it started, who these evil, sad, unhappy people were and what their plan was. Because you cannot see any of the madness going on today and make any sense of it unless that is understood. So if you're not educated by the Frankfurt School, don't miss. Because, you know, I did a talk on it a year ago, and I asked people, and there's 50 people in the room, who's heard of cultural Marxism? Everybody. Who's heard of the Frankfurt School? Nobody. And when I was talking about it, I could see everybody sitting there going, why didn't I know this? Ask yourself the same question when you see it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, it's been great talking to you guys. Thank you, Matt. Always a pleasure. I owed you some early mornings anyway, right?
Pardon?
I owed you some early mornings anyway.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you stay on for 2 seconds, Matt?
Yeah, sure.
I need to ask you a couple of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Everyone, thank you so much. Till next week.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you, Eamon.